For 1,000 years, the Catholic Church controlled something more powerful than any army. It controlled information. If you couldn't read, and most people couldn't, the Church told you what the Bible said, what God wanted, what would send you to heaven or hell. Knowledge was locked inside handwritten manuscripts, copied by monks, owned by the powerful, completely out of reach for ordinary people. Then one man in a German city built a machine, and within 50 years, everything the Church had built its authority on, the monopoly on truth, was gone forever. The printing press didn't just change how books were made, it broke the medieval world open and built the modern one in its place. To truly understand what Johannes Gutenberg unleashed in 1440, you have to understand the world before him. In medieval Europe, books were extraordinary objects, not because of their ideas, but because of the sheer physical labor required to produce them. Every single book was copied by hand, usually by monks working in scriptoriums, writing carefully onto vellum made from animal skin. A single Bible could take a trained scribe a full year to copy, a single year, which meant that books were staggeringly expensive, vanishingly rare, and owned almost exclusively by the church, universities, and the wealthiest nobles. That scarcity was not incidental, it was structural. When information is rare, the people who control it control everything. The Church had built its authority over 1,000 years partly on the fact that it stood between ordinary people and the sacred texts that governed their eternal souls. Priests interpreted Scripture, bishops defined doctrine, popes spoke for God, and because almost nobody outside the clergy could read Latin, the language of the Church, almost nobody could challenge what they were told. The system was self-reinforcing and nearly impenetrable. Nearly. Gutenberg was a goldsmith from Mainz, Germany, and the exact details of how he arrived at his invention remain somewhat mysterious. He was famously secretive, and much of what we know comes from lawsuits against him by his financial backers. But the core of his achievement was movable type, individual metal letters cast from a tin alloy that could be arranged into words and pages, pressed onto paper with ink, and then rearranged and reused for an entirely new page. It sounds simple, stated plainly. Its consequences were anything but. Before Gutenberg, Europe produced perhaps a few thousand books a year, all handwritten, all painstakingly slow. Within 50 years of his press beginning operation around 1450, historians estimate that more than 20 million books had been printed across Europe. 20 million in 50 years. The entire information ecosystem of Western civilization had been detonated and rebuilt. Books that had previously existed in only a handful of copies now circulated in thousands. Ideas that had been accessible only to a tiny literate elite were now spreading faster than any authority could track, contain, or suppress them. The first major book Gutenberg printed was, thinningly, the Bible. The Gutenberg Bible, produced around 1455, widely considered one of the most beautiful books ever made. The Church initially welcomed the technology. More Bibles, more devotional texts, more reach, what could possibly go wrong? The answer, of course, was everything. Because the press didn't just print what authorities approved, it printed everything. And the first genuinely explosive thing it printed arrived 60 years later in 1517 when an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of a church in Wittenberg. Luther's argument was theological, a furious attack on the Church's sale of indulgences, the practice of selling forgiveness of sins for money. It was a critique that other reformers had made before him and been quietly suppressed or violently eliminated. But Luther had something no previous reformer had possessed. Within weeks of posting his theses, they had been copied, printed, and distributed across Germany. Within months, they were circulating across all of Europe. The Church moved to silence him, as it had silenced others, but this time there were 10,000 copies of his argument already in circulation. You cannot unprint a book. You cannot burn every copy. You cannot arrest an idea that is already everywhere. Luther understood the press with the instincts of a genius communicator. He didn't just write in Latin for scholars, he wrote in German, the language ordinary people actually spoke. His translation of the Bible into German, completed in 1534, was a revolutionary act. For the first time, German-speaking people could read Scripture themselves in their own language, without a priest as intermediary. The Church's monopoly on biblical interpretation, the foundation stone of its authority for a millennium, shattered. The Protestant Reformation was, in a very real sense, the first media revolution in Western history. But the press wasn't done. It didn't stop at religion. Scientific ideas that would have circulated among a handful of scholars now spread internationally with unstoppable momentum. When Nicolaus Copernicus proposed that the Earth orbited the Sun in 1543, his book, printed in an edition that reached scholars across Europe, could not be taken back. When Galileo later expanded on that heresy, the Church tried him, forced a recantation, placed him under house arrest. The books were still out there. The ideas were already loose. The printing press had created, for the first time in history, a body of knowledge that could not be unlearned by institutional command. The press also transformed politics. Pamphlets, cheap, fast, and devastating, became the political weapon of the age. The English Civil War, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, all of them were fought partly on paper, in print, through a war of ideas and arguments that the press made possible and that no government could fully control. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January 1776, sold an estimated 500,000 copies in a colonial population of 2.5 million people. It is difficult to imagine the American founding without it. The printing press didn't just report on revolutions, it made them possible. Literacy itself was transformed. When books were rare and expensive, there was little incentive for ordinary people to learn to read. As printed books became cheaper and more widely available through the 16th and 17th centuries, the motivation and opportunity to become literate spread steadily downward through society. Schools expanded, literacy rates climbed, a reading public emerged, curious, skeptical, increasingly unwilling to simply accept what authorities declared. That reading public is the direct ancestor of the modern democratic citizen. The Church never recovered its monopoly on truth. Monarchies that had ruled partly through information control found their grip loosening. The medieval world, hierarchical, static, built on the authority of tradition and institution, slowly gave way to a modern world, built on individual inquiry, scientific method, free expression, and the radical idea that ordinary people had the right to think for themselves. Gutenberg probably didn't intend any of this. He was a craftsman trying to make a better book. But the machine he built in that German workshop didn't just change publishing, it changed what human beings believed they had the right to know and who had the authority to tell them. That shift is still happening. Every time you read something that challenges what you were told to believe, you are living inside Gutenberg's revolution.